My grandfather died without telling me a single word about the plan he had already set in motion to protect everything I was about to lose. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. Because when I finally understood what he had done, I didn't feel victorious. I felt like a man who had been caught in a rainstorm and only realized, after the fact, that someone had quietly sewn a raincoat into the lining of his jacket years before he even knew the weather could turn. My name is Kerem, and this is the story of how my grandfather saved me from my own family without ever saying a word about it. Let me take you back to the summer I turned 22. My grandfather, Hasan Bey, had just passed away after a short illness. He was the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and said very little. A carpenter by trade. A quiet, deliberate man who measured twice and cut once in everything he did, not just wood. He and my grandmother had built a small manufacturing workshop on the outskirts of the city decades ago. Nothing glamorous. A metalwork and fabrication unit that supplied parts to construction firms. But over 40 years, that modest workshop had grown into a piece of commercial property worth a significant amount. The land alone, by the time Hasan Bey died, was valued at just over 4 million lira. The building on it, another two. He left no dramatic final words. He died the way he lived, quietly. And in the weeks after the funeral, before the grief had even fully settled, the plan began. I didn't see it at first. That's the thing about quiet betrayals. They don't announce themselves. My father, Orhan, and my uncle, Murat, are brothers. On the surface, they're ordinary middle-aged men. My father runs a small import business. My uncle spent most of his life borrowing money from mine. Between the two of them, they had decided, without telling me, that Hasan Bey's property was already theirs. I was the third heir. My grandfather had 3 direct heirs under Turkish inheritance law. My father, my uncle, and me. Each of us held a 1/3 share in that property the moment Hasan Bey took his last breath. What I didn't know was that my father and uncle had been having meetings about that property for months before my grandfather even died. I found out the way you find out most important things in this life. By accident. I had stopped by my uncle's apartment to drop off some documents my father had asked me to deliver. The door was half open. I heard my uncle say, and I remember this with absolute clarity, "He doesn't understand any of this. He'll sign whatever we put in front of him. He always does." I stood in that hallway for a long moment. Then I knocked. They both looked up. My father smiled. My uncle reached over and turned the papers he had been holding face down on the table. "Kerem, come in. We were just talking about the estate process. Complicated stuff. Sit down." I sat down, but something in me had already changed. A door had closed that I couldn't reopen. Over the next 2 weeks, I began to understand the full shape of what they were doing. A developer named Gökalp had approached my father about purchasing the workshop property. The offer was legitimate. A cash sale at market value. The kind of deal you'd be foolish to refuse on paper. Except for one detail. As a 1/3 heir, I had to sign the transfer documents. And I had already told my father, quietly, that I didn't want to sell. That property was the last physical thing my grandfather had left on this earth. It smelled like metal shavings and machine oil. When I walked through it, I felt like I could still hear him. I told my father this. He nodded and said he understood. Then the pressure started. First it was phone calls. Then it was family dinners where the conversation kept circling back to how much I needed to think about my future, about how this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, about how I was being sentimental in a way that was costing all of us money. Then my uncle started showing up at places I'd be. At my gym. At the tea house I went to on Tuesday evenings. Always casual. Always with the same quiet insistence wrapped in a friendly face. Then came the threats. Soft ones first. If you don't cooperate, this will drag through courts for years and the property will lose value. Then sharper ones. You have no idea how these things work. You're 22. We are trying to protect you. I started sleeping badly. I lost weight that summer. I was a young man with a legitimate legal claim being ground down by the 2 men in my life who were supposed to model for me what it meant to have integrity. And then, on a Thursday evening in August, my father called me and said the words that I now consider the turning point of my life. "Kerem, the sale is scheduled for the 19th. The notary has the documents. Your signature is already on them. Come to dinner on Saturday, and we can talk about your share of the proceeds. Your signature is already on them." I sat in my apartment for 6 hours that night. I could not move. The signature my father referred to was not mine. I had never signed anything, which meant one of two things. Either my father had made a catastrophic error or someone had forged my name on a legal property transfer document. I picked up my phone. I called a law school friend named Barack who had just started working at a small firm. I told him what my father had said. I heard him exhale slowly. "Kerem," he said, "if that's true, that's not a civil matter. That's criminal." The next morning, I went to the property registry office and requested a copy of the pending transfer documentation. The signature on the consent form was not mine. It had my name. It had something that resembled my handwriting if you weren't looking carefully. But I had never held that pen. I had never sat in front of that notary. I had never agreed to any of this. I stood outside the registry office in the August heat, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the day my grandfather died. I felt completely alone. I had no money for a serious attorney. I had no leverage. I had two men with decades more experience than me who had apparently already decided to simply write me out of the story. The sale date was 11 days away, and I was holding a photocopy of my own forged signature. This is where I need to tell you about a letter. 3 days after I discovered the forgery, I received an envelope in the mail. Standard white envelope. My name and address handwritten in a script I recognized immediately. My grandfather's handwriting. I sat down before I even opened it. Inside was a single folded page and a business card. The page read, and I'm going to read this to you as closely as I can remember it. "Kerem, if you are reading this, then I am gone and something has gone wrong with the property. I always knew it might. You were the one I trusted. You were the one who came to the workshop and actually wanted to learn. The others only ever wanted to know what it was worth. I made arrangements. Call the number on this card. His name is Aydin. He has been waiting for your call. Do not be afraid. It is already handled. I love you, Oglum." I turned the business card over in my hands. Aydin Selik, attorney at law. I called the number. The man who answered had a voice like old wood. Calm, dense, unhurried. "Kerem Bey," he said, "I've been expecting your call. Your grandfather asked me to wait until you reached out on your own. He said that if you called, it meant you needed it. He said if you never called, it meant everything was fine. I'm glad you called. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" I was there at 8:45. Aydin Selik was a man in his late 60s with an office full of organized files and no artwork on the walls. He shook my hand. He poured tea. He opened a thick manila folder and placed it on the table between us. And then he explained to me what my grandfather had done. 7 years before he died, Hasan Bey had approached Aydin Selik with a specific concern. He had watched his two sons over the decades, and he had understood something about them. He loved them, but he did not trust them with the workshop. He had seen the way they looked at the property. He had seen what money did to people he had raised with his own hands. So he had made a different kind of arrangement. Under Turkish law, there is a legal mechanism whereby a property owner can establish structured disposition conditions tied to an inheritance. Working with Aydin, Hasan Bey had filed a specific annotation on the title deed 7 years prior. This annotation established that the workshop property could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the written, in-person, notary-verified consent of all 3 heirs, obtained within a structured legal process that included a mandatory 15-day review period and independent legal representation for each party. In plain language, my grandfather had made it structurally impossible to rush through a sale. He had built a legal waiting period into the title itself. Any attempt to fast-track a transfer, any forged consent, any pressure sale, would trigger an automatic flag in the registry system. The forged signature my father had submitted had already been flagged. Aydin had been notified automatically because he was registered as the legal contact for the title annotation. He had already filed a criminal complaint with the prosecutor's office regarding the document forgery. He had already filed for an injunction freezing any transfer of the property, pending investigation. All of this had happened before I even walked into his office. My grandfather had not just left me a letter. He had left me a fortress. He had spent 7 years quietly maintaining the walls of it, so that when the attack came, and he knew an attack would come, I wouldn't have to fight. I would just have to walk through the gate he had already unlocked for me. I asked Aydin when my grandfather had last spoken to him. He checked his files. 3 weeks before he died, he said. He came in person to update your contact information and confirm the envelope arrangements. He was already quite ill. He drove himself here. I couldn't speak for a moment. The image of my grandfather, a man in his late 70s, sick, driving alone across the city to make sure my address was correctly filed in a legal folder, is something I carry with me every single day. He knew he was dying, and instead of making peace with it, he drove to a lawyer's office to make sure a forged signature couldn't steal from the grandson who used to sit on a stool in the workshop and watch him work. Now let me tell you what happened to my father and my uncle. The criminal complaint regarding the forged signature moved through the system over the following months. The developer GoCalp, once he understood the legal situation, withdrew his purchase offer and walked away. He had no interest in a transaction tangled in fraud allegations. My father denied any knowledge of the forgery. He suggested my uncle had handled the notary paperwork. My uncle said the notary himself had made an error. The notary, when interviewed, said he had worked from documents already signed when they arrived at his office. No one could produce a clean story because there was no clean story to produce. Neither of them went to prison. The criminal process in Turkey for document fraud at this level is slow and the outcomes are uncertain. That is the honest answer. But the sale did not happen. The property remained in the estate. The title annotation my grandfather had placed remained in full effect. And eventually, after a very long and very cold silence in my family, I exercised my legal right to a petition proceeding. The property was professionally valued. My 1/3 share was calculated. My father and uncle, who by that point had significant legal fees and a poisoned relationship with every developer who had heard about the dispute, accepted a buyout arrangement. I received my share. In full. Legally. Cleanly. I did not scream. I did not make speeches. There was no confrontation scene where I looked my father in the eye and delivered a verdict. If you are expecting that, I am sorry. That is not what happened, and it would not have felt true to the man who taught me how to do things. What happened was, I deposited the funds. I sat in my car outside the bank, and I cried for about 20 minutes. Not because I had won, but because I finally understood the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. The kind that measures twice, cuts once, files the paperwork correctly, updates the contact information even when your hands are shaking from illness, and then trusts you to make the phone call when you need it. I think about the men in our lives who show love the way my grandfather did, without performance, without the need for acknowledgement. They simply build things that will hold weight after they are gone. I think about what it means to be underestimated by people who should know you best. My father and uncle looked at me and saw someone who would sign whatever was put in front of him. They were not entirely wrong about who I had been. But my grandfather had looked at me and seen someone worth protecting years before I had any idea I would need protecting. That gap between who people think you are and who someone who truly sees you knows you can become, that gap is where everything important lies. If you are in a situation where people are pressuring you around property, around inheritance, around documents that don't feel right, I want to tell you 4 things my grandfather understood that took me far too long to learn myself. First, legal protection, when placed correctly, does not require you to be strong in the moment. It requires someone to have been careful long before the moment arrived. Second, the people most likely to underestimate you in a legal dispute are the people who assume your emotional attachment to something means you cannot think clearly about it. That assumption is their weakness, not yours. Third, document everything. Every conversation, every phone call, every piece of mail. Not because you are paranoid, because memory is unreliable and paper is not. Fourth, if someone tells you that your signature is already on a document you never signed, that sentence is not a negotiation. That sentence is evidence. I still drive past the workshop sometimes. A different business runs out of it now. The sign has changed, but the structure of the building is the same. My grandfather built it to last, and it has lasted. I think that's all he ever wanted from anything he made. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who protected you quietly without asking for credit, or if it made you think about something in your own family situation that you've been putting off addressing, then I hope it gave you something useful to carry. Stay safe, and call the lawyer while you still have time.